war in Ukraine is quickly escalating into a wider horror. And from what I can see, practically nobody in this chamber is doing anything to prevent it. In fact, most people seem to get off on the fact that it's escalating. And at this precise moment, of course, as usual, the voices challenging the rush to war are attacked and silenced, smeared as traitors, cronies, Putin puppets, Kremlin stooges, Russian agents. Frankly, it's pathetic. And I don't make the comparison lightly, but the crudeness and cynicism of these slurs coming from mainstream EU parties might as well have been written by Hermann Göring, who infamously said that even though people never want war, they can be brought to war with threats and smears. He said, all you have to do, tell them they're being attacked, denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing their country to danger. It works the same every way. Where he led, you are following. This House should be ashamed of this debate. Words are being twisted, meaning subverted, and the truth turned on its head. Opposing the horrible madness of war is not anti-European. It's not anti-Ukrainian. It's not pro-Russian. It's common sense. The working class of Europe have nothing to gain from this war and everything to lose. And I find it laughable that those calling for arms to Ukraine never call for arms for the people of Palestine or for the people of Yemen. Unlike you, I oppose all war. I want it stopped. I make no apology for that, and I'm not going to be scapegoated and labelled for it either. Thanks very much, President. I really feel that the European Union has to cop itself on if we don't want to get caught up in the US efforts to destabilise the Taiwan Strait in the manner in which they have done with Ukraine at such enormous cost to the citizens of Europe, be they Ukrainian, Russian, or indeed citizens of the EU itself. If we're worried about cross-strait tensions, we shouldn't be doing anything to make them worse. For decades, the One China policy has guaranteed stability and peace in the Taiwan Strait. It doesn't give anybody everything that they want, but it gives everybody enough to avoid the possibility of war. And yet we see this ambiguity being dismantled by ignorant fanatics in the US administration and Congress, and a foolish appetite by some in the EU for a confrontation with China, with of course China predictably responding. We risk a runaway escalation. The Tough Guy Act can be emotionally satisfying for some, but it's reckless, stupid, immature foreign policy. If we care about the people of Taiwan, we shouldn't be dismantling the arrangements that have protected them for decades. Do we really want another war? Do our citizens? Of course, the arms industry in the US do. Thanks very much, President. My problem with this report is that Libya seems to have been forgotten in it, getting only the vaguest of mentions, but then Libya always seems to be forgotten. I can't remember any urgency or resolution in here since I started dealing directly with the fact that Libya is now hell on earth for the people who live there or who are stuck there. And given the direct responsibility of a number of European countries for the NATO operation that destroyed Libya, it should always be top of our agenda. Given that the EU is effectively collaborating with acts of murder, torture, imprisonment, rape, enforced disappearance perpetrated in Libya's prisons, which the UNHCR concluded last year were crimes against humanity. Given the discovery of mass graves by the UN investigators last March, we might be more focused on it. But of course, the reality is that the EU wants to look away. We're all over crimes against humanity when they're committed by countries outside the EU, but we want nothing to do with the ones we've caused, we finance, we support, and give our blessing to. If hypocrisy had a name, it would be called the EU. I voted against this report because while there's some good bits in it, overall it's confused and deceptive. It purports to be a call to defend multilateralism, but instead it attempts to redefine it and turn it into its opposite. Multilateralism in a multipolar world means working through genuinely inclusive bodies such as the UN on the principle of sovereign equality, where each country has a say. It means listening to the people that you disagree with. It doesn't mean groups of so-called like-minded partners forming a little gang, be it the G7 or the G20, and negotiating your own rules and then imposing them on the rest of the world. That's the opposite of multilateralism, but that's the way it's defined in this report. We should be calling instead for upholding international law, but instead this is about rules-based international order. That isn't international law. That means the rich countries making up the rules and giving everyone else orders to follow. We couldn't be more in need today of returning to genuine multilateralism, but unfortunately this isn't it. Thanks very much, President. I voted for this motion. I'd like to compliment the work of our very own Damien Thompson from Fair House in Dublin, who was the main negotiator on the text, and we're very proud and happy to see it. But we have to be honest as well that a lot of the good stuff in this is contradicted by our actions. The motion acknowledges that we're not doing enough, that the Green Deal and Fit for 55 are grand as they are, but they're not enough. And we have to look at things like the decisions we've made in terms of the vote on EU taxonomy, which gives a role to private investment in gas and nuclear in the green transition. We've got to look at us bringing back in filthy frack gas into Europe, reigniting coal plants in the so-called name of the war against Ukraine, when the biggest war on earth is the war to save our planet. So we have to be very careful here. The issue is clear. We can continue to bend the knee to vested interests and keep the pressure on the European Union to protect their profits, to continue growth, or we can take a sustainable course. I'm very glad that a lot of good measures are contained in this report, but the job of work will be to have it implemented. Thanks very much, President. For me, this resolution is a hodgepodge of unverified and wildly exaggerated claims, laced with a strong dose of hypocrisy, as the right-wing groups beat their breasts over mass data collection and mistreatment during security screening of refugees, all seasoned with a hearty dollop of pure invention. There's no doubt about it that the stuff the Russians are doing in screening Ukrainians entering Russia is bad. Fingerprinting, facial biometrics, invasive background checks, detention, all nasty stuff that would be very familiar to anybody who tried to enter the European Union over the past decade. There's no question that those detained in screening are having a horrible time, but I don't remember the right wing jumping up and down about the detention filtration camps in the European Union where refugees are kept for years, where the conditions are so bad that people set fire to themselves to end the horror. We have a UN statement on this issue. It's a world away from this resolution. There should be an investigation of verified claims, and international bodies need to take human rights seriously. The Parliament should stop turning itself into a pathetic parody of a tabloid newspaper. I'm really annoyed that I had to abstain on this motion because of an outrageous recital giving out about Hungary blocking sanctions against Russia. If Hungary wants to block sanctions because their economy is dependent on Russia, that's their business. If they want to block sanctions because they love Putin, we mightn't agree with it, but that's the law of the European Union. European treaties give them that right. But what this recital does is say that Hungary blocking and exercising their legal right is unacceptable and dangerous. That's hardly accepting and respecting the rule of law, is it? What it is doing is saying the rule of law is fine, except when people we don't like exercise it. Sounds very Orban to me. And unfortunately, because of this, the Hungarian government will now have an excuse to dismiss this report as politicised. We're undermining our actually very strong case with regard to the disastrous rule of law situation in Hungary. And on top of that, we're alienating the minority groups in Hungary who don't agree with Orban's policy on Russian sanctions, but the people we're supposed to be supporting. So it's a really serious precedent. If we accept this, what next? Will we have a data protection resolution on Ireland saying that our neutrality is a threat to European security? It's just not good enough. Very much, President. Let's face it, we can't say we weren't warned. Fossil fuel consumption is unsustainable. And of course, we should have been a long way down the road by now, moving to environmentally friendly, renewable, public-owned energy. We could have built, we could have invested, we could have been ready for the inevitable crisis, but we kicked the can down the road, allowing greenwashing by big business. And now, having shot ourselves in both feet with backfiring sanctions that have allowed Russia to sit on a record current account surplus while turning off the gas to Europe and forcing old people and poor people to go cold or poor this winter because of the action of European powers. It's absolute lunacy. As big energy shakes its hand with glee, US LNG operators laugh and reap their dividends. And Europe goes back to burning more fossil fuel. It's about time the Commission and the Council started to cop on. Ordinary citizens of Europe paying in their cost of living or environmental damage is not the way forward. We need publicly owned energy. Credit Suisse. We gather here, and month after month the people of Afghanistan suffer and die. They die from hunger, from lack of access to medicine, from earthquakes. They die because they want to send their girls to school. 53 mainly young women slaughtered in Kabul last week, and our president couldn't even mention them earlier. And increasingly they die because they are Hazaras. Hundreds murders, thousands persecuted. These people are at risk of genocide, and yet the world says and does nothing. And of course, now that the US and its friends have found a new theatre of war in Ukraine to test their weapons and launder their arms profits, Afghans are no longer needed. Discarded with all of the problems of 20 years of an intervention left at the hands of the Taliban, whom the US created. It is an affront that the Biden administration has spent $15.2 billion on military intervention in war in Ukraine, while seizing $7 billion of Afghans people's money. For God's sake, what have these people done to endure this endless horror while the world does nothing? It's time to speak up, stand up, and demand justice for Afghanistan. I don't think you'd have to be a genius to know that the last thing the Horn of Africa needs is more foreign military bases, more weapons, and more European meddling. What we call our strategic relationship isn't about human flourishing, it's about the EU's ambitions as a superpower. There's now a new great game in the Horn of Africa. Greater and lesser powers are pockmarking the place with military bases. France, the US, China, Germany, Japan, Italy, Saudi Arabia all have a presence in the tiny area of Djibouti alone. Mercenaries are swarming in from all quarters. The entire region is being militarized. War is in the air. And what about the people facing climate and food insecurity? None of this benefits them. We talk about instability, but we only make it worse. We flood the place with weapons, hand over the profits to European arms companies, and charge the bill to our citizens. And then with the carnage, we go back in and we do it all again. It's a racket. Strategic relationship, it's one thing after another, isn't it? Really, it's the same as it ever was. And all I can say is, God save Africa from Europeans offering help.